Welcome, good morning everybody, and we're about to complete the second chapter of Pirkei Avos, so that's a big achievement. I did mention to you last week that we'd be putting two mishnas together. That's just because you have to kind of learn them in tandem, because they carry, it's like a carry-through message from the one Mishnah number 14 to the other Mishnah number 15, and really only makes sense to learn the two of them together. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to learn two Mishnahs in a row together. And they are both attributed to a sage called Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon is a very powerful personality in early Talmudic literature. Rabbi Tarfon was a colleague of the famous Rabbi Akiva. He's considered one of the great scholars of that period of time. And a few interesting anecdotes about Rabbi Tarfon. In addition to the fact that he was this incredible sage and he was held in such high regard, Rabbi Tarfon was also a Kohen. And in those days, to be a Kohen and to have access to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Holy of Holies, meant that amongst other things, once a year on Yom Kippur, you got to learn, depending who you were, depending what Kohen you were, but Rabbi Tarfon was one of those people. He got to learn the special name of Hashem that is only ever shared on Yom Kippur. Rabbi Tarfon, as it happens, was also quite a wealthy man. One particular occasion, he invested with Rabbi Akiva. Never a good idea to invest a large amount of money with a rabbi, because it's not going to work exactly as you would have expected. And in this particular case, Rabbi Akiva came to him and said, listen, I've got this amazing investment for you. I'm going to invest in a whole big town or series of villages that we're going to own. It will cost you 4,000 golden coins. So Rabbi Tarfon said, fine, that sounds amazing, I'm in. And he gave him the 4,000 golden coins, came back a little while later, and it turns out that Rabbi Akiva had taken all of that money and distributed the money to destitute rabbis. So Rabbi Tarfon said, I don't get it. You said you're going to invest in these villages. So Rabbi Akiva said, well, what greater investment? This is Hashem's villages that we've invested in. Rabbi Tarfon really appreciated that. And he gave Rabbi Akiva this big kiss, and he said, thank you for investing wisely on my behalf. Rabbi Tarfon was also known, probably more than anything else, for his incredible kibud aim, the incredible honor that he showed to his mother. When his mother was elderly and it was difficult for her to get in and out of bed, he had actually crouched down so that she could kind of step on his back to be able to get off the bed. And Rabbi Tarfon's mother told the story, which is quite a well-known story, that on one particular occasion she was walking and the strap of her shoe snapped. And so she didn't have a shoe. She couldn't walk. She was an older woman. And so Rabbi Tarfon, even though he was this great scholar, and of course he could have been very concerned about his own appearances and his own honor, he went down on all fours and he put his hand under her foot so that she wouldn't have to walk on the uncomfortable ground. Either way you look at it, Rabbi Tarfon is seen as an incredibly important person at this point in history, an incredibly important contributor to the Talmud. So what Rabbi Tarfon is going to teach us is the principle of Jewish time management. Now, many people will tell you Jews are not good at time management, right? We talk about Jewish time, yes? Ever been to a Jewish function that starts punctually? Well, I suppose they do happen occasionally, but it's incredibly uncommon. I always feel that Jews get jittery if something starts early. Like, hey, what happened? You know, there's supposed to be a little bit of a buffer zone. And yet, when you see what Rabbi Tarfon has to teach, you're going to see that time management is actually a really, really big deal for us as Jewish people, and it's something we have to pay attention to. So we'll read, like I said, there are two mishnas that we're going to read concurrently. So we'll read through both of those mishnas and get an overview of what it is that Rabbi Tarfon teaches us. And then we'll take it apart into its different components. What you'll probably notice right at the beginning, once we look over this mishnah, or the two mishnas, you'll probably feel that there's an element of contradiction in what Rabbi Tarfon is saying. And that's going to be a big issue that we have to address over here. So let's see, what does he say? Rabbi Tarfon says, Hayoim kotzer, the day is short. V'hamelocha meruba, and the workload is great. So if you ever feel that you're stressed or that you're pressured and you never have enough time for anything, and you're just the to-do list seems to never end, well, Rabbi Tarfon could commiserate. He says that's how it is. The day is short and the workload is great. However, there is another problem, says Rabbi Tarfon. V'hapoyalim atzelim. By nature, the workers are lazy. So that's a problem, right? If you have a lot of work and you don't have a lot of time, really what you need is quite an energetic crew. But Rabbi Tarfon notes that just as much as there isn't a lot of time and that there is a lot to do, unfortunately we have the problem that the workers are not the most efficient workers. And that's ironic, he says, because v'haschar harbe, because there's a tremendous amount of reward if you do it, if you fulfill what it is that's on the agenda. And ubal habayis doichek. That's the end of the first Mishnah, Mishnah Yudalet, Mishnah 14. Bal habayis, which means the master, in this case we're talking about the master of the universe, doichek, consistently puts pressure on us to get this job done. So effectively what he seems to say to us is that life is short and the expectations of Judaism are great, and Hashem, who gives us those expectations, is impatient, constantly pushing us for more and more. But don't worry, because it's going to be worthwhile. In the end, you'll get a great reward. What we are going to have to examine is, why does he say Hayoim Kotzer, that the day is short? Why doesn't he say something like Hazman Kotzer, that the time is short? In other words, there's got to be a reference over here to why specifically he says it's the day that is an issue, something to consider. And of course, another way to have said it would have been Hachayim Kitzarim, life is short. But he doesn't say that. He specifically says that the day is short. Also, we have to work out what work exactly are we referring to over here. Yes, of course, everybody has an agenda, and everybody has a to-do list, and everybody has a bucket list, and everybody has a whole lot of things that we believe that we need to achieve and that we don't necessarily have enough time to achieve, etc., etc. But the real question is, what work are we referring to over here? And I suppose by extension, what reward are we referring to? Okay, so that's Mishnah 1 that we're going to look at today. Let's go straight into the next Mishnah because it's going to create context, and of course there's going to be this strange tension and paradox that seemes to emerge between the two Mishnahs. Hu haya oimer. So the same sage, the same Rabbi Tarfon, he used to say, Lo alecha hamilacha ligmor. The work is not yours to complete. Now, at this point, you should start to see the contradiction. One second. The first Mishnah seemed to be so much pressure. There's much to do, there's not a lot of time, people are generally lazy, the Balabais, which is Hashem, has got his finger on the pulse, and he's pushing us. And now he says, but don't worry, because you don't have to finish the job. So surely that's one phrase that totally undermines everything we said before. It reminds me a little bit of a story I once heard about, those of you who know Rabbi Hecht from Chabad of Santon. So his father, his late father, Rabbi J.J. Hecht, says that he was once traveling with the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was a young man at the time. I don't even know if he was married yet at the time. They were traveling together. And he was reading correspondence that the Frierdiker Rebbe had received. And he was reading this letter. This one letter was these tremendous accolades and how much the person respects the Rebbe, etc., etc., etc. And then right at the end, after a long letter, right at the end, he had one line, which was obviously the purpose of the letter. You know how those conversations go. First you beat around the bush and you say all the platitudes, and then eventually you get to the point that you really want to say, and that was an element of criticism that this individual had. So he introduced the word of criticism with the word but. So the previous Rebbe smiled and he said, in America, they have this word but that you could use to undermine anything. You could say, you're a wonderful person and I really respect what you're doing, but, and with that you've killed everything. So that's kind of what it feels like over here. There's a lot of pressure, there's not a lot of time, there's much to do, there's pressure from the... But you don't have to finish the job. Well, okay, thank you very much. That's all I needed to know. I don't have to finish the job, so the pressure is off. Everything you said in the preceding Mishnah seems to dissolve the minute you read this Mishnah. So straight away, Rabbi Tarfon appears to catch himself, and he says, "V'loi ato ben chorin lihibatel mimeno." One second, don't think that just because you're not required to complete the entire job, that means that you're exempt. No, you're not ben chorin, you're not free. You don't get to choose that you're not going to be busy with the job just because it's not for you to finish, where people often think, there's somebody else who'll take care of it. Someone else will take care of it. It's like that joke. I don't know if you're on a neighborhood WhatsApp group. So I don't know if it's a brocha or if it's the opposite of a brocha, to be on a neighborhood WhatsApp group. Because basically you hear every little thing that goes on in the neighborhood, and this one say, did you hear this? Did you see that? Whatever. So what happens on a neighborhood WhatsApp group? The power goes out. So straight away everybody says, did your power go out? Did your power go out? Did your power go out? Why doesn't somebody just phone the power utility and report the fact that the power went out? No, somebody else will do that. So, lo yalecha melacha ligmor, the minute a person is told that the job is not yours to finish, it's a collaborative effort, we're all in this together. So then a person could think, well, in that case, I don't have to do the heavy lifting. Somebody else can do it. There's professionals there. There are official rabbis in the community. There are community leaders. There are people looking after welfare. So he says, Loi ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena. Don't think that you have the freedom to choose, that you'll exempt yourself from the responsibilities that you have. It does not work that way. So all in all, it looks like we're building some kind of a balance. On the one hand, there's pressure. On the other hand, don't think that the pressure means that you have to do everything. On the other hand, just because you don't have to do everything doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything. And then he says, almost as an incentive, Im lo madata torah harbe, if you learn much Torah, noisnin loch schar harbe, then they're going to give you much reward. It's only at this point that we start to understand what the melacha that Rabbi Tarfon was referring to means. You would have thought melacha means work in the classical sense. But now he starts to reveal to us, he's actually talking about learning Torah. Because that's what he says, if you learn much Torah, you'll get much reward. So that gives us the context that the melacha work that we're talking about, where there's not a lot of time, and you really have to get it all done, is actually talking about the work of learning Torah. And therefore he says to you, if you learn a lot of Torah, you're going to get a lot of reward. And don't worry, he says, if you think that the reward is not coming as quickly as you'd like, because usually we have a certain impatience. Hello, I did something, how come I'm not seeing the results? So he says, don't worry. Don't worry. The person who is in charge, the same balabayas that we originally referred to as doichek, the one who's putting tremendous pressure on you to get this work done, don't worry, is absolutely reliable to pay you. Whatever reward is due to you, it's absolutely reliable. You do not have to worry. He's going to pay you. That's just how it's going to be. And then he says, and be aware of the fact that shematan scharon shel tzadikim le'asid lavoy. And you must remember that the reward for righteous people is not really experienced in this world, it's experienced in the next world. So effectively he's saying, if you do all these things that I advise you, don't become impatient if you don't necessarily see that you're getting rewarded in the here and now, because actually the reward is not about the here and now. It's actually about what's going to come in the next world. Okay, so there we have basically the core principles of this Mishnah. So let's break it apart. Let's understand what this Mishnah is telling us, what all the various lessons are, because of course they're important to us. And let's, try and create a little bit of context, something that we could relate to in our own world. So the simplest way to understand it is he's saying Ayom Kotzer, that the day is short. Simply what he's saying is life is short. So don't delay, don't procrastinate, don't push things off for later, because at the end of the day, there's no guarantee that there's necessarily going to be a later. But what seems to emerge over here, and as I mentioned, the big question is there seems to be this tension, because on the one hand, he says pressure, no time, much work, high expectations, don't be lazy, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, he says, but don't expect that you could finish the job yourself. So right there, we get a very important psychological balance, because what happens often within Judaism is that very often you look around and you see all the things that Judaism demands and the expectations of the Torah, and you think, whoa, I'm completely overwhelmed. How am I ever going to do any of these things? Or at least, how am I ever going to do all of these things? Or any of these things the way that they're supposed to be done? So effectively, what he wants to create for us over here is an understanding that we need to know the difference between somebody who is doing their level best and recognizes that they will never get the job done 100%, versus the person who becomes negligent or lazy. And that's really the balance he's creating over here. So he says, the fundamental principle is there's not enough time to achieve what Hashem expects of us, because he expects a lot of us. So therefore you have two choices. There are two ways in which people might respond to that. The one way is you're going to try your absolute best. You're going to say, look, I know I'm not going to be able to do everything. It's not for me to complete, but I'm going to push hard. So to that person, Rabbi Tarfon says, great, that is the correct attitude. In other words, acknowledge the fact that you're not going to achieve everything, perhaps not even in multiple lifetimes. Like the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, says that a person's soul returns to this world again and again and again until you reach the point that you've fulfilled all of the mitzvahs and that you've studied all of the Torah. Now the truth is that you might even come back to this world multiple times and never do all of the mitzvahs. It's a reality. Why? Because certain mitzvahs require such strange circumstances that you don't want to ever have to go through those things in your life. Let's say, for argument's sake, there's a principle called yibum, right? So yibum is where a man dies, leaving his wife without any children, and now the wife has a mitzvah to marry his brother. It's such a remote case, it doesn't apply nowadays. It hasn't applied for hundreds of years, since the time of the Sanhedrin or whatever, when they put a moratorium on it. So how's a person going to keep coming back and fulfill that mitzvah? It's so rare, it's going to happen to, who knows what, 1 in a million people. So you might think, you might think there's so much melacha, there's so much expectation from Hashem, but what am I going to do? I'm going to do my best. It's not my job to work out which opportunities Hashem's going to give me for which mitzvahs and for which part of Torah. All I am responsible for is doing my best, that I've got to learn as much as I can, do as many mitzvahs as I can, and as best as I can. The other attitude that a person takes is the defeatist attitude, which basically says, this mountain is too high, I'm never going to be able to climb it, so there's no point even trying. Says Rabbi Tarfon, that's the problem. You should never adopt an attitude which says, because something is too difficult, therefore I should do zero. So let's use, for example, somebody who wants to keep Shabbos. Ideally, that's their motivation, that's their aspiration, they would love to keep Shabbos. But as far as they're concerned, it's not possible. It's not practical. It's not practical for a variety of reasons. I feel compelled to have to do business on Shabbos. I feel compelled to be able to use technology on Shabbos, whatever it is. So what does he say? You do not have to begin the process by trying to work out how you're going to get 10 out of 10. But you're neither exempt from trying. So try something for Shabbos. And perhaps once you do one thing and you get used to that, you'll be ready to progress to the next thing, and so on and so forth. That's how it's going to go. But the person who adopts the defeatist attitude and says this is all beyond reach and I'm not going to go anywhere, that person is done. They don't get out of the starting blocks. And nothing's ever going to happen in their life. Now, what's interesting is if you go back in history, we're told that when Moshe went up onto Mount Sinai in order to receive the Torah, so it says that he was there for 40 days and nights. And when he returned afterwards, he told the Jewish people that for those 40 days and nights, he did not sleep, he did not eat, he did not drink. So some people will tell you, there's a source in the Talmud that says that the reason he didn't do any of those things is because when in Rome, when in heaven, do as the angels do. So if you're hanging out in heaven and angels don't sleep or eat or drink, so you have to do the same thing. And in the reverse also it works that way. So when angels come visit Abraham and Sarah, so the tradition is that humans eat. So when you get offered food, you make a show as if you're eating. That's the simplest way to explain it. He had to behave in line with the expected protocols of the place. But there's another explanation, a wonderful explanation, and it's explained by virtue of a metaphor, a parable. Imagine that there was, forget about it, the parable for 1 second. Let's use something relatable. Imagine you won a trolley dash at Kosher World, right? The pre-Pesach trolley dash at Kosher World. So basically you've got 1 minute to run through the shop and pile whatever you possibly can into your trolley, right? Ever dreamt of that? Some people dream of that. One day, and I wish I could win, that kind of thing. So for that 1 minute, you realize Hayoim Kotzar, that the time is very short. V'hamelocha meruba, and what I want to achieve is very great. So I don't have time right now for other things. I don't have time to schmooze, to check my WhatsApps, I don't have time. I've got to be focused and I've got to achieve everything that I could possibly achieve. So the parable that's used is the fellow who's invited by the king to walk into the royal storeroom, and he has 1 minute to take whatever he can possibly get his hands on. That person for that 1 minute is going to be the most focused human being you'll ever meet in your life, because it's just, what can I grab that is most valuable as quickly as I can, as much as I could possibly carry. So using that mashal, they said that when Moshe went up onto Mount Sinai and he was receiving the Torah, at that point he was having something that would never be repeated in life ever again, an opportunity to learn Torah directly from Hashem. Who's got time to eat? Who's got time to sleep? There is this window of 40 days of direct absorbing knowledge directly from Hashem, without any filters. I don't have time to waste. That's what Rabbi Tarfon would like us to feel, generally speaking, about our Torah learning. When I sit down to Torah, let's be honest, I don't have the opportunity to learn Torah 24/7. So when I sit down to learn Torah, whatever period of time I have, the attitude that I have to take is an attitude of, I'm in, 100% focused. I cannot afford to look anywhere else, because Hayoim Kotzer, this period of time that I've got for learning, is very limited. V'hamelacha meruba, and there's a great amount of opportunity that I could achieve right now. So I'm going to put the phone on silent, and I'm going to lock myself in a room where the kids can't find me, whatever it is, and I'm going to focus completely on Torah learning for this period of time. And then there are some of the Mefarshim who say the reason he says Hayoim, the day, is because life itself is divided into different segments. You have the Yoim of life, and you have the night of life. You have the daytime of life, the nighttime of life. What is day? Day is when everything is bright and clear. That's when a person is young. When a person is young, everything is clear. You can learn easily. You remember well. You don't have to, it just flows. But then you get like the dusk of life, later on in life, where it takes a lot longer to absorb material. It's more difficult to remember the material that you've learned. So Hayoim Kotzer, Rabbi Tarfon says, because who was he talking to primarily? To yeshiva students. Those were his people. Hayoim Kotzer, the opportunity that you have in youth, where you can learn Torah with that freshness of the youthful mind, and without all of the responsibilities that are going to come later in life. This is a short period of life. V'hamelacha meruba, what you could achieve in that period of time is going to last for a lifetime. Like when we were in yeshiva, they always used to say that if you have a house that needs to be heated in the winter, let's say you'd like your house to be a nice, comfortable 28 degrees. So you light a fire in your house. You have a little fireplace. The fireplace can't be 28 degrees, because then the house is going to be freezing. The fire has to be, 300-400 degrees. And that way your house will be this nice, comfortable 28 degrees. So the period when a person is in yeshiva, that's like the fireplace for the rest of your life. Hayoim Kotzer, it's a short period of time. V'hamelacha meruba, where there's a great responsibility to fill yourself with as much learning, inspiration, clarity, principles, values, which are then going to guide the rest of your life. So that's really primarily who he was speaking to. V'hamelacha meruba, he says, at the end of the day, the workload is immense, because the pasuk, the verse tells us that the nature of Torah is rechava me'eretz midah. It is broader than the whole world. In other words, Torah, there's so much information and there's so much knowledge. There's so much to learn, even on a single subject. You think about the weekly Torah portion. So we come back every single year and we read the same Torah portion every single year, and every single year, hopefully, we find another depth and another perspective and another commentary and a different insight, and suddenly you realize that the Torah is actually beyond. You'll never reach a point where you can say, I've got it, I've mastered it, and now, I've kind of finished it. So that's what he's warning us. He says you have to understand, you have to appreciate hamelacha meruba. There's really so much learning over here. When we were in camp as kids, so they used to have a section every morning before you started the day, before you had fun. There was always a section of davening and learning. And at the end of that period, when it was time to now go and play and do sport and whatever the case is, the head counselors would always make an announcement over the intercom, and they'd say, learning never ends. But we're going to take a small break now to be able to do whatever activities you want to do. Because that's how it is. Learning never ends. Hamelacha meruba. So hamelacha meruba, that's why he tells you don't be lazy, right? We mentioned already that Rabbi Tarfon identifies two possible attitudes, and the one attitude is the person that says, I can't do this. It's never going to happen. It's too much information, too difficult. I don't know the language. I don't have the background. I don't have the time. I don't have the head. So he says, the nature of a lazy person, unfortunately, is that they will find the path of least resistance, and they'll find the best excuse to get out of doing what it is that they have to do. So he warns us, he says, that the knee-jerk reaction of a person who sees the quantum of how much Torah it is that you're supposed to learn, so then you suddenly realize, I might start to become lazy. He says, don't become lazy. Don't become lazy. Why not? Because Hashem is putting pressure on you. What does it mean Hashem puts pressure? Most of us think, look, I go to my shiur once a week, And Hashem should be very proud of me, if he would understand, as he probably does, if he'd understand my limitations, my intellectual limitations, my spiritual limitations, my time constraints. Hashem should be really proud of me that I go to so many shiurim in a week. Well, what does Hashem really want from us? The Torah tells us that Hashem wants us to invest in Torah learning day and night, 24/7. That's what he wants. Meaning to say that you can never get to the point where you say, I'm not able to learn it, because he says, well, you could have taken more time. Right? Very famous. I've been thinking about it a lot. How we spend time. You see people. It's fascinating in today's world. You see people everywhere, anywhere. It doesn't matter what they're doing. Could be in a social context. Could be at a red light. Could be at a school concert. Whatever the case is. People always with their face in their phones. It's quite incredible. It's actually quite frightening that it's become so much a part of the norm of society that nobody even, you don't look at somebody askance and say, wow, that's weird. Look at that person. Like, here we are in a social gathering and they're on their phone. Like, it doesn't even strike us as unusual. You look back, as happened to me the other day, sitting in the minyan, and I look back and there's somebody totally in the middle. Like, it's not even strange that in the middle of shul a person will be on their phone. I mean, it's completely unacceptable, right? But that's how we've become. You could be sitting out for a meal with friends. It's a social context. You could be sitting at the table with your children, and the next thing, we're on the phone. So you think about it, any normal person would say, the amount of messages that I get in a day, it's too overwhelming, and I'll never have the opportunity to get back to all of them. I'll never read all of my emails. Ever felt that way? I'll never read all of my emails. So when last did you see somebody say, so because of that, I'm getting rid of my phone? Because it's just not doable. I'm canceling my email because it's just not doable. No, what do? Every free moment that we have, we're on the phone catching up. And it's not even a question that that's an acceptable way to behave. That's what we do. That's what Hashem expects of us when it comes to Torah. Yes, lo yalecha hamelacha ligmor. You're right. You don't have to complete the entire thing. You don't have to read every single email in your inbox. But that's not going to stop you from reading emails. You don't have to reply to every single WhatsApp. But that's not going to stop you from reading WhatsApps. Lo yalecha hamelacha ligmor. You're not going to learn the whole Torah. In fact, you're not even going to learn a fraction of the Torah. You're certainly not even going to learn the amount of Torah that Hashem expects from you, the individual. But that shouldn't stop you. That should not stop you from learning. On the contrary, that's exactly, we have the best example of how to do this from the modern world. Whenever you get a free moment, you steal a look at your phone. So whenever you have a free moment, you should steal a look at a Torah book. Sounds bizarre, right? Don't worry, you can get the Torah book on your phone. And you can even get audio clips that you can listen to your phone with your earphones while you're in the car. Amazing thing. Instead of listening to whatever nonsense is on the radio, you could be listening on your phone. There are so many amazing bite-sized Torah thoughts that a person can get during the course of a week that you could listen on. It's like the most beautiful thing. I haven't listened personally. I have not listened to a radio in years because thank God now we have this technology. You have podcasts, you have shiurim, you have stories, you have vertlach. That's what Hashem wants of us. We don't have an excuse to say, I don't have the opportunity, I don't have the time. Opportunity today is greater than it's ever been in our history. And so yes, we might never become masters of Torah, but you'll be surprised at how much you can get in 1 week if you have the right content to read and to listen to on a phone. And that's effectively what he's talking about. Right? Okay, but there's another thing to consider here as well, and that's human nature. I mean, I guess everything we're speaking about over here is human nature, but there's another thing about human nature. The other thing about human nature is that we are, by definition, we are people who are driven by a sense of satisfaction. What motivates a person to do something? Knowing how satisfying it will feel at the end when you've completed it. That's just how we are. So let's use an example that's very dangerous territory, and that's called Pesach cleaning. Yes, dangerous territory. You don't want to set people's blood pressure over a certain level at this time of the year. So now what's the objective of Pesach cleaning? Is it that after you feel, you sit down to the Seder and you feel satisfied, I did everything properly and I followed the halachas and I did it? Or do you sit down to the Pesach Seder and think, sure, I don't know if I really got into every nook and cranny of the couches, right? Which one is it? So by nature, people are drawn towards things that are going to give them that sense of satisfaction once they've achieved them. That's what we'd like to do. So if there's something called Torah learning, I would love to be able to say, I am now making a siyum. I've just completed an entire segment of the Torah. I feel good about myself. I can gather my friends together. It's a mitzvah to make a siyum and everything. That's how we feel. Rabbi Tarfon says, Loi alecha hamelacha ligmor. Up until this point, we've translated that as, it's not your responsibility to complete the whole job. But now we can also see it as a philosophical insight, where he's saying, your motivation should not be the completion of the job. That's nice for you. That's a great sense of satisfaction for yourself, because then you turn around and you say, I did it. But that should not be our motivation. Why do we learn Torah? Not to gain accolades, not to have X amount of books under our belt, not to be familiar with X amount of subjects, but rather because there is a Baal bias, because there's a higher authority that we are committed to, who will reward us. And that's why he says, if you learn a lot of Torah, you'll get a lot of reward, meaning to say, even if you don't complete it. It's not about finishing things and being able to have that little egoistic moment where you could say, wow, shkayach, look at me, I'm amazing. But rather it's whatever you do, Hashem gives value to what you do. So our goal is to learn for Hashem's sake rather than for our satisfaction. That's what Rabbi Tarfon wants us to appreciate and to understand. Also, when he says that when you learn a lot of Torah, you'll get a lot of reward, what does it mean to learn a lot of Torah? It's a very difficult thing to quantify. If somebody sits in a yeshiva and that's their full-time occupation, obviously they're going to learn a lot more Torah than us. Or what about a person who's just an absolute genius with a photographic memory? So they are going to learn 10 times, 20 times as much Torah as we'll do, because what we have to review a number of times until we've got it, they've got in a flash. So what does he mean when he says if you've learned a lot of Torah, you're going to get a lot of reward? What he's telling us is, it's not about the quantity of how much you've learned. It's the question of how much learning you have done. You see the difference? If I think if I think that the goal is to complete things, so then the quantity of how much learning I've done is actually what counts, and Hashem will only pay me, so to speak, or reward me once I've done a lot. So if there are 25 books on my shelf, I'm only going to be rewarded once I complete and commit to memory 25 books. And if I have 250 books on my shelf, well, then I'm in a lot of trouble. You know, it's nice to have a nice looking Jewish library, but it's much nicer to actually use the library. So if you think that Lamadatot Torah Harbe, that you've learned much Torah, means the quantity of how much information you've got, then you will miss the point. Because what does Rabbi Tarfon tell us? It's not for you to complete the mission. It's for you not to be lazy about it. In other words, the reward that we get for learning Torah is for the learning more than it is for the knowledge that follows the learning. If you have somebody who's maybe a little bit challenged intellectually and it takes them a very long time to understand something and they really have to schwitz over it and they keep going back again and again and they feel tremendous frustration, and at the end their sum total of everything that they have learned is not a fortune, so what? It's the learning. If you've learned a lot of Torah, that's what counts. Not if you've mastered a whole lot. That's Rabbi Tarfon's message over here. We're not in a competition of who completed the task, who got the furthest in the book, who finished the most books, who knows the most halachas, or anything like that. It's that you're not lazy. That's the point that Hashem is interested in, your investment. They tell a story, I believe it was Reb Moshe Feinstein. They tell a story that there was a fellow who he became a Baal Teshuvah, he became frum, and he went to a yeshiva and he knew how to learn, and his father kind of tagged along behind him and also became quite a religious Jew, and he decided, his son is learning Gemara, so he also wants to learn Gemara. And so he took a page of Gemara and he learned this page of Gemara, and it went for months and months and months until he completed the page, both sides of the page, what we call a daf, both sides of the page of Gemara. And he was so excited that he had completed this page of Gemara that he wanted to celebrate with a siyum. He wanted to have this big, appropriate mitzvah celebration of the fact that he had finished the daf. And the son was quite embarrassed because, usually you make a siyum when you finish an entire masechta, a whole tractate of the Talmud, when not of a page. He was very self-conscious, what's he going to do? His father's going to embarrass him in front of everybody. So I believe it was Reb Moshe Feinstein. He went to for advice, And he told him, you make that siyum, because for your father, that achievement of finishing that daf, it deserves a siyum. It wasn't easy for him. He invested a tremendous amount of effort. He learned. That's what counts. Well, this is not a business of how many books you've got under your belt. It's how much effort you've put into the learning of Torah. And that's what Rabbi Tarfon really, really wants us to understand over here in the course of this particular Mishnah. Then, of course, he tells us, Schar HaTzadikim, that the reward for tzadikim is in the world to come, meaning to say that you get people who unfortunately don't really do exactly what Hashem wants. They've got their own agendas. They're running after all kinds of other things. So their perception of what's valuable in life has to be here and now, has to be tangible. And so therefore, in that person's mind, if they don't see money in the bank or whatever else it is that they wish for themselves, as far as they're concerned, it's a waste and they've lost out. Rabbi Tarfon says you have to understand that a tzaddik, which effectively is a code name for all Jewish people, because when we learn Pirkei Avos at that time of the year between Pesach and Shavuos, we always add in Kol Yisrael at the beginning, the quotation from the last chapter of the tractate Sanhedrin, where it says every single Jew is called a tzaddik. V'amei kulam tzaddikim. We're all called tzaddikim. Means to say that the Jewish perspective is, I don't need something in the here and now, something that's tangible and bankable, in order to say that I've got something of value from Hashem. I'm able to appreciate and to see that actually what really counts is something which is beyond, and something which is intangible, and something which I'll only appreciate in the next phase of life, in the next stage of the neshama's journey. Now, one of the things that we've touched on quite a number of times through the course of Pirkei Avos is that Pirkei Avos is not the letter of the law. It's what we call mili de chasidusa. Once you are already committed to fulfill the requirements of Jewish law, comes Pirkei Avos and says, now how do we take you beyond the requirement of Jewish law? With that in mind, let's have a look at the structure of this Mishnah, because we've definitely seen that it's a paradoxical Mishnah, or two Mishnahs. So let's have a look at it with that particular concept in mind. How does he start? He says, Hayom kotzav hamelacha meruba. The first thing that you have to know is there's not a lot of time and there is a lot to do. That means to say, I could, as a Jewish person, I could turn around and say, I have fulfilled my requirements as a Jewish person according to the law. The law says that if I'm employed, for argument's sake, and I have other responsibilities and I'm not a full-time yeshiva student, then I discharge my responsibility of Torah learning by learning something every morning, perek echad shachris, a segment of Torah learning in the morning, or perek echad arvis, and a segment of Torah learning in the evening, and I'm done. Comes along Mili de Chasidusa, Pirkei Avos, that says, let's go beyond the requirement of the law. And then I say, beyond the requirement of the law means not only am I going to learn enough to, so to speak, check the box and say, I did what I had to do, but Ayom Kotzer V'Amlocha Meruba. From a perspective of Mili de Chasidusa, I realize there's never an end. There's never a ceiling. There's never a moment that I can turn around and say, I'm done. I've learned as much as I possibly could. So that's why he starts off by telling us there's a tremendous amount of pressure, because there's always this opportunity to look further and to grow further. Once I hear that, though, I also have to balance it and I have to say, one second, but loy alecha hamelacha ligmor. Meaning to say, I can't complete the whole thing, right? I can't complete the whole thing. In other words, I have to understand a very important principle. And the principle goes like this. As I learn, the nature, and this is what you could call the, what do they call it? The occupational hazard of learning Torah, is that the more you learn, the more you come to realize that what there is to learn. That's the occupational hazard of Torah. So I recognize that even beyond the requirement of the law, there's an obligation to go further and to learn further. So I could say, look, okay, I'm good. I'm not lazy, like Rabbi Tarfon warns, don't be lazy. And I'm pushing really hard to learn. And then he says, V'lo yalecha hamelacha ligmor. What does it mean, lo yalecha? That it's not up to me to finish the learning. Because the more I learn, the more I realize how infinite Hashem is, and therefore by extension how infinite His Torah is. That's when I start to realize I can't finish it. In other words, we thought that the implication of you don't have to complete the job was just because simply you look around and you say, practically, I don't have enough time as I would like to have, and I'm going to try my best. But there's a deeper layer that Rabbi Tarfon is teaching us over here. He's teaching us that as I learn more, by nature I will then come to realize that it is an impossible thing to complete. Because Torah is effectively infinite, and obviously I'm finite. Now that could dishearten a person. So therefore he says, don't worry, because the one who is, so to speak, your master, the one who, so to speak, is going to reward you, he's good for the reward. In other words, even if you're not going to ever get to the end, not only you're not going to get to the end, the more you learn, the more distant the end appears to be, don't let that dishearten you, because Hashem will take care of you. However, he also says, which means, if your motivation to learn, and this touches back onto something we mentioned already before, if your motivation to learn is purely because you want the satisfaction of saying, I completed this, then you might not be as motivated as you should. Means you are not, this is not optional, this is not personal. As a Jewish person, the way I'm supposed to approach Torah is with a sense of what we call Kabbalas Ol Malchus Shamayim, which means I accept Hashem's authority. I accept Hashem's, what we call the oil, the yoke of heaven. Why am I learning? Because that's what Hashem wants me to do. And if it turns out that in the course of the infinite wisdom that is available, the infinite amount of Torah, if it turns out that I basically don't even move a millimeter in my learning, it doesn't matter, because the main thing is I'm doing what Hashem wants from me. And that's really Rabbi Tarfon's take-home message over here. The minute a person tries to shape their Judaism to suit a personal agenda, they will feel disheartened and they will find it difficult to be able to achieve. Once a person recognizes that I learned Torah because I'm not a free spirit, I am committed to Hashem. Back at Sinai, my soul made a promise to Hashem. And before I was born, as the Talmud tells us, I made a promise to Hashem. So therefore I'm bound and therefore I'm committed, and that's why I'm learning Torah. If a person has that kind of a motivation, then you will succeed in learning, and you will succeed in feeling the satisfaction of knowing I'm doing what Hashem wants, even if I don't have the satisfaction of always feeling that I've rounded off and completed a whole section. Ironic as that is, we have now completed a section. Completed the second chapter of Pirkei Avos, and please God, that means that next week we can move to the third chapter and a whole different, so to speak, theme.